this is an email that was sent to me by a doctor at the VA, and it reads, to all staff, the VA recommends that providers stop any prescribing of, I should say, spiverdectin is what I call it on YouTube.
Right.
Spiverdectin
I know.
for the treatment of COVID-19 unless the agent is being used as part of a clinical trial. Currently, there are no ongoing Bay Pines VA clinical trial for utilizing spiverdectin in the treatment of COVID-19. The
Right.
prescribing of spiverdectin by any of the Bay Pines providers will be closely monitored to avoid any unauthorized use. Please contact pharmacy service for any additional information related to the indications of prescribing spiverdectin. And, these emails are sent out daily, just like you should be doing this and you should be doing that. But the interesting part was I thought was that you will be closely monitored to avoid any unauthorized use, which means basically you better not be prescribing this if you're within this hospital system. And then,
Yeah.
this is what comes with it, that, this is what the FDA says, according to their veterinary medicine, blah, 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 blah. And then within the VA and the CDC. So all they do is just pump out the government's talking points because, right, this is a federal government hospital. But if you're a doctor who's like, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking that I've read some stuff that this might help some people, and they ask me for it. Like, what if your patient comes in and says, I'd like to try this, but like you're basically being told that you're going to be brought in before some kind of ethics board if you veer away from it. So are we shocked that the debate around this issue publicly has very little dissent, whether it's being allowed or the dissent's even there? Like, well, where are the doctors speaking out about it? Why are there only like
Yeah.
5 big names speaking out about it? Well, this is why. Because like what doctor is I mean, the hospital system itself is telling you every day that if you veer away from protocol, you're going to be monitored. Like that to me is the ultimate of no patient choice, because now it's not between you and your doctor. It's between you and the politics of your hospital system or the
Yeah.
money and funding of your hospital system, not what your doctor thinks is best. That's scary to me.
Yeah, and this is exactly how these hierarchical systems work. I mean, this is again like a passive aggressive form of control. It's controlling behavior. It's actually abusive behavior, right? If you look at this from this family systems perspective, where it used to be, actually, if you read anything about medical ethics, I mean, the first thing you're going to find is informed consent, but then you're going to find a lot of literature about the doctor-patient relationship and the sanctity of that, and that doctors, as long as they're using informed consent, really should have in an ethical environment a lot of control about what they're prescribing. Like once they get that certification, once they become a doctor, then they're independent. They're supposed to be able to act independently of these hierarchical systems, and they're supposed to treat each patient as an individual and to the best of their ability using informed consent. So the patient can then make a choice as to what treatment they want for themselves, right? But in the current system, it's become so hierarchical. And another thing that's brought to mind was, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, there were a lot of doctors who were general practitioners. And I don't think the system could have ever gotten away with this 30 or 40 years ago, because there were a lot of independent doctors that were working for themselves, that would just have, their own 1,000 patients or so. And they took care of, it was general family practitioner, right? And over the last 30 or 40 years, and this kind of gets into this, where we started this conversation about the certification processes and, all of these different ways that the government or these corporate bodies have gotten involved to make individuals more and more beholden to this hierarchical system. A lot less individuation, to use a psychological term, like individual autonomy to make their own decisions, but instead now so many, especially in the medical field, these doctors are beholden to being a part of these hierarchical systems. The general practitioners have gone out of business. It was too expensive. The business model didn't work. And so now they're working for hospitals. Well, the hospitals can tell the doctors what treatment protocols to prescribe, just like the VA hospital just came out with this, but in private practice and private hospital systems, it's basically the same way, because the private hospitals the insurance companies will only pay for these treatment protocols that the CDC or the FDA have approved. or the American Medical Association, which work closely with the CDC, and then the insurance companies will only pay for these treatment protocols, and then the doctors that work for the hospital systems that use those insurance platforms have to use these treatment protocols. And if they stray from that, they're basically going to get fired because the hospital won't get paid for any different treatment protocol other than the approved protocol from higher up in the system. And this, I mean, it's just rife for corruption, right? I mean, all the doctors at the bottom of the pyramid have to do what they're told from the top. If a handful of people at the top are only concerned about corporate profits and not really concerned about the health of the vast majority of the people, then all they have to do is direct the whole system to do what they're told, and everybody else has to do what they're told. And if they speak out, yeah, I mean, their jobs are in danger. It's not a free society, right? It's not a healthy emotional environment at all. And then there's all of this passive aggressive activity that's going to occur within these systems against those who are starting to question or disagree with what the hierarchy says. And psychologically, it's so powerful. It's just unbelievable. I did a few interviews, and I followed pretty closely the hydroxychloroquine issue a year plus ago now. And it just all the different ways. I mean, if the government cared about early treatment, then they would be funding these studies. Another thing that they've done is they've made it so expensive to do a large randomized controlled study, which now they claim is the only true science. And then the only institutions that can afford to do these large studies would be the government or these big pharmaceutical corporations. And you'll notice that they're simply not funding these trials. The VA is not funding a trial about an early protocol for which there are dozens and dozens of peer-reviewed papers at this point showing that it's highly effective. Why aren't they? Why aren't they right on top of that? Why didn't they start doing that a year and a half ago? What's the early treatment for this disease? Instead, it was always about, you know, the mandated procedure that they're imposing on everyone right now, and also telling us all that this is the only choice that's for the good of the community. And anybody that brings up another choice that might also be good for the community is getting hushed in these variety of passive aggressive methods.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a friend who's my age. So 40, just turned 40. All right.
Congrats.
Thank you. Beginning the second act of a 2-act show. I made it. It's better than the alternative.
Right.
But I have a friend who she's an MD, general practitioner, master of public health. Okay. So she got all the abbreviations. And when we were discussing spironolactone, and another doctor's use of it for their own COVID treatment, when they got COVID, she was like, I'm not saying anything. This is nuts. You know, and like, I have nothing to say. It was like what we were talking about, like the triggered situation where now you're not talking logic anymore. So the conversation should just stop. But her response was, it's not an opinion. Cause I was like, well, other doctors have, different opinions. And why don't we have a debate? Why don't doctors allow for debate? She goes, well, it's not about opinion. It's about evidence. And there's no evidence. And it's interesting when someone stops at that point without saying, okay, is there no evidence because we've worked really hard at trying to understand this and we just haven't found the answer, or because we're not looking for it. We're not looking for an answer because we have a reason not to. And that's like the next level of critical thinking when it comes to where we're at, is to say, okay, well, now some would argue that there is plenty of evidence, okay, when it comes to this stuff, but apparently not the evidence that the CDC says. Even if you look at the WHO's website related to spironolactone, all they say is that we just haven't done, like you're saying, we haven't done these vast randomized clinical trials. It's not that it isn't working, and it's not that it is working. We're just basically saying we don't know. And then yet that gets turned into the horse paste. Like somehow it goes from, we just don't know because we're not funding the research, to you're a horse if you're even considering talking about this. And so yeah, it's like the next level of awareness when it comes to that stuff, that you only find what you want to look for. If you're not interested in looking for something, then you're not going to find an answer to it. And then the pressure of the people who would look into this stuff to not look into it is high. You know, when the funding comes from the very people who are trying to suppress
Right.
that conversation, you know, would it be easier to just do some research on something else? You know, and when I was an environmental reporter, I saw that all the time. There were interesting and worthwhile research studies that could have been done about any number of very high profile topics, like the southern resident killer whales being one of them, because there's only, you know, tens of them left, and so there's all this money being thrown at what's really going on. And I would talk to nonprofits that wanted to look into one or another thing, and they're just like, if we go that route, or we even talk to you about the blind spots we think like NOAA is suffering from related to this, that are causing the attrition of this very species they say they're trying to save, we'll lose our funding
Mhm.
for our research for other things. And so there's a lockdown on their interest in being able to talk about this stuff. And so I think it's really important for people to understand that when we're dealing with something that's just so partisan, so hypercharged with just emotional reactivity, and the special interest involved in it, and the money and all, just everything that you could throw at this, COVID and all this stuff is just wrapped up with a bow like a Christmas present, you know, with just all these things, that the psychology and at every level, that you have to really be careful about the like no evidence argument, you know, because like, what does that really mean? What does it mean when we as a society just like that's just our that's a full stop. We're not even willing to discuss anymore because there's just no evidence. Just be careful of that, because there's a reason
Yeah.
like you're not seeing certain things, and it's not necessarily because it's not there.
Right. Well, it's definitely interesting you bring up the funding aspect, because the funding, I mean, first of all, they make it so expensive, especially as I said, to do the gold standard tests and the peer reviewed studies. So expensive that who can afford to do it? Well, the government or these corporations can afford to do it. Well, the government, again, these are the people at the top of this hierarchical system that we've been discussing. And so they can basically determine, like you say, you're not going to find what you're not looking for. So what are they looking for? Well, they're looking to find the most profitable for, you know, the group that controls the top of the hierarchy. They're not, I mean, certainly in my opinion, I think there's a mountain of evidence that these organizations do not have the good of the general population at heart. They're making money for the insiders that have control of the top of this pyramid. And so the funding absolutely controls the narrative. I mean, people are not going to be looking outside the box when they know that their funding is going to dry up. That's the end of their career. And then if they look too far outside of the box, the government has this certification process that we've also discussed, so they could completely get wiped out if they get too far outside of the dominant narrative. I mean, it's a complete methodology of control. But what you talk about with the evidence and the science and not an opinion, I also did another interview with Julianne Romanella where we really analyzed this one MIT paper that came out, I don't know, 6 or 8 months ago now, where they literally in the paper called it lurking. We lurked on social
Mhm.
media to analyze all of these anti-vaxxers to find out what the heck they were talking about, right?
Mhm.
So they were spying on people. They didn't just engage and ask questions like a healthy person would, but instead, apparently, they surveilled,
Yeah.
you know, these social media sites. And they discovered, much to their chagrin, that the people who were engaging in this crazy anti-vax universe had a very high degree of scientific literacy. They discovered
Hmm.
they were very educated. They would help each other learn the science. The experts that were participating in the conversations would actually break down the data. They would take the data, break it down, and make their own graphs. The paper was actually about how to make good graphs that convince people to follow the system's protocol, right? The dominant narrative.
Mm.
And they said, well, we put these graphs out, but then what the anti-vaxxers were doing was actually going to the primary data and then creating their own graphs out of the primary source data that would argue their point of view. And they were doing so, my God, with a high degree of scientific literacy. So it's very difficult to convince these people who are smart, educated, about the science and going only to the primary source data for material and not trusting our, our interpretations and our graphs to convince them to go with the dominant narrative. And this was a problem for them. And one of the things that they brought up was that they said these people seem to have an issue, a different, they called it an epistemology of science. It's really the philosophy of science that they were discussing. They have a different philosophy of science where they don't just trust the hierarchical system where the scientists at the top of the system tells us what science says. It said they had this crazy notion about science, that science was a process of inquiry where people could find different data sets and different evidence and then have to change their mind, their personal opinion based on this process of science that was ongoing. And so we ended up having this conversation about what is science really. And you find that, certainly the people that wrote this MIT paper, right, were indoctrinated into this idea that it's a hierarchy and that people at the top of the hierarchy understand. So it's not an opinion because Dr. Fauci said it, and so it must be true. And it gets in deep into your concept of like, what is truth and how do we know it?
Right.
And
Totally.
So they're trying to convince us that, well, the scientists at the top of this hierarchy know it because they've seen all the evidence and they understand what's going on. But in reality, the point that you brought up, I think, is not brought up enough about we aren't going to find what we're not looking for. Like there's a certain thing that why is science focused on looking at this, but not looking at that, for one thing. The universe is infinite, so we can find a lot of different things, and science never finds the ultimate truth. It can be, a step on the way, but every 100 years or so, there's a new scientist that comes out that blows the whole paradigm. And basically the whole system kind of starts over again from a different perspective altogether. So, it's just funny to me that people, again, I think it's a form of passive aggressive, like controlling behavior and then avoidance. Well, the system of science tells me the truth. I just do what they say. And I'm not going to acknowledge that there is this scientific method and this process, and other people could do different experiments that end up, blowing this paradigm out of the water and showing that a different methodology is actually way more functional. It's just a difference in an idea behind the philosophy of science itself that actually relates back to everything we've been talking about today, which is, does truth kind of come from this hierarchy and this system, or does it come from our own critical thinking and then our abilities to make choices for ourselves, because we can apply critical thinking to these issues that we have in our own personal lives?
Don't forget to check out my sponsors. I have a wine sponsor, AllisonWinePromo.com, AllisonWinePromo.com. They just switched out the bottles, so if you got the last 3, check out the new 3. There are some really good ones. One from the oldest vineyard in Argentina. You get 50% off the wine itself and 50% off shipping. Or you can also check out TwinEngineCoffee.com, TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison. And these are Nicaraguan coffees, high altitude, shade grown, USDA organic. I prefer dark roast, but they've got a bunch of different kinds. They also have a tea that you can make out of the coffee fruits. It's called Cartura. I think I'm saying it correctly. You brew for about 24 hours. If you like cold brew or hot brew, you can do both. I really like it. Little different, but kind of like tea. And it's just another way to get a little bit of caffeine, not as much as coffee, and the antioxidants that come with it. So AllisonWinePromo.com, TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison, and I'll see you next time.